some people are trying to dismiss the Scott Morrison secret portfolio scandal. I think that's wrong. There are plenty of times when I rail against a media feeding frenzy. There are plenty of times when I think the political media especially all run one way and beat up a sense of scandal when it's hardly justified, especially against Conservatives. Just think about Morrison and bushfires, for a starter. But just as I said last night, there should be outrage about these revelations. The sense of scandal is wholly justified. It's been revealed to be even worse today, and those who downplay it, I think they really need to think about the implications for good governance in this country. Now, you hear a phrase like good governance and you think, yeah, we know, we all want decent government, and too often we get let down. But it's more fundamental than that. Good governance, proper processes, the clarity and supremacy of the rule of law, and accountability through our democratic and legal systems are absolutely the basis of national prosperity, fairness and success. What's the one thing that separates successful liberal democracies from the basket case nations around the world? It isn't resources, natural or human. It isn't luck. It isn't even some post-colonial hangover. It's good governance. If a country has open, accountable and democratic government, it invariably succeeds. We should never take that for granted. We now know that Scott Morrison had himself sworn in as an extra health minister, and in this case, the real health minister, Greg Hunt, actually knew about it. But Morrison was also sworn in as finance minister, and we learned today treasurer and home affairs minister without those ministers even knowing. And then there was resources minister, another case altogether. Ministers whose powers defined their roles didn't even know the PM had taken up those powers too. And why? Because he didn't trust them? Because he wanted the ability to overrule them? Because he couldn't stand the thought of others having more power in a pandemic than him? What was it? He tried to explain it all to 2GB's Ben Fordham this morning.
We were dealing with quite extraordinary circumstances, and as a result, we had to consider some rather unconventional, well, I wouldn't even say that, because I understand on occasions things like this can happen, but we had to take some extraordinary measures to put safeguards in place. Fortunately, Ben, none of these in the case of the finance and the health portfolio ever were required to be used, and they were there as a safeguard, they were there as a redundancy.
Look, there's just no need to do this to replace a sick minister. It happens all the time. Someone acts in their role. It's done with the stroke of a pen. Happens regularly and it is usually announced in the Parliament or publicly. And if the powers of ministers were so great during a pandemic that they needed sharing, then why keep it secret? Why not announce it to the Parliament, to the public, and especially to the Cabinet and the ministers who are being usurped in this way? What's more, two of these appointments, Treasury and Home Affairs, two massive portfolios, happened in May last year, well over a year into the pandemic. No wonder fellow Liberals are gobsmacked by all this. Here's the former Home Affairs Minister.
I think the actions that he undertook in swearing himself into numerous portfolios and not disclosing those to the ministers responsible means that he needs to resign and he needs to leave Parliament. They're my views. That's what I think he should do.
Does it make you feel as though he didn't trust your judgment?
I'm not taking any of this personally. There were multiple portfolios that the former Prime Minister really seemed to have sworn himself into, and I think individually and collectively it was not the right thing to do in secrecy. There may well have been very good reasons for him to do that. That should have been disclosed prior to, or at least at the time that the swearing in took place.
Does this undermine democracy?
It certainly doesn't help democracy, and I'm very concerned about the impacts of this going forward. And to be honest, I feel that the Australian people were betrayed.
The Australian people betrayed. The current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has called for urgent legal advice on all this from the Solicitor General.
There have been revelations of an extraordinary and unprecedented trashing of our democracy by the former Morrison government. This has been government by deception. Government in secret, the appointment of not a shadow ministry by the Leader of the Opposition, but a shadow government by the Prime Minister.
The opposition leader, Peter Dutton, is another one who's been taken by surprise by all of this, but he refused to attack Scott Morrison today or preempt what should happen next.
The Prime Minister has sought legal advice. He gets that legal advice back Monday, and there's a process that's in place. So I think we should respect that process, and let's see what the Prime Minister is able to advise next week.
Now, not only were these ministers not aware of the arrangements, neither were their department heads. Some of the most senior public servants in the land didn't know they had two bosses, effectively. We had one Prime Minister secretly shadowing the powers of 5 senior ministers and not telling the Cabinet, the Parliament or the public about it. There was no transparency and therefore no accountability. Morrison issued a statement this afternoon offering a fuller explanation. It detailed how the arrangements were supposed to be an in case of emergency break glass measure that were never used. That doesn't ring true. It's easy to organise acting minister provisions and swearings in as required. As I mentioned before, it happens all the time. Morrison now concedes in hindsight that the arrangements were in the main unnecessary. But the Prime Minister did use the powers as resource minister to block a politically sensitive gas exploration permit. So the powers were used for a political outcome. And that minister at the time, Keith Pitt, was told only when that happened. Still, the former Prime Minister concluded his statement today with an apology. I have endeavoured to set out the context and reasoning for the decisions I took as Prime Minister in a highly unusual time, Scott Morrison said. I did so in good faith, seeking to exercise my responsibilities as Prime Minister, which exceeded those of any other member of the government or the Parliament. For any offence to my colleagues, I apologise. I led an outstanding team who did an excellent job and provided me great service and loyalty as ministers. For those of us who warned throughout the pandemic, this is extraordinary to see this from Scott Morrison. Of course, he had more responsibility than anybody else in the Cabinet. He had 5 extra jobs secretly. Now, as I mentioned, for those of us who warned throughout the pandemic about government overreach and the lack of democratic oversight and accountability, these revelations are astounding. They prove it was actually much, much worse than even we knew at the time. Prime Minister Albanese has promised a post-pandemic inquiry of some sort. We need a royal commission into the overreach of governments during the pandemic. Until now, I've been certainly most worried about the drastic and over-the-top actions of the state governments. But now we must investigate all levels of government, the closed borders, international and interstate, the over-the-top lockdowns and restrictions, the reckless wasting of money, the infringement of our rights, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the sidelining of parliaments and cabinets, the status of national cabinet. And crucially, we need to see the often cited but never shared medical advice. Only a full inquiry can lead to the right legal changes and prevent all this happening again.